Today I want to take you on a little journey to a really curious nation. It's a place a traveler named Lemuel Gulliver stumbled upon, and he called it the Republic of Hats. And what he found there, wow, it tells this powerful story about how we divide ourselves, about identity, and about the power of the symbols we wear.
I mean, just think about that for a second. What if a nation's entire destiny, its whole political reality, boiled down to the color of a hat? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But that's the central question here. Could something so simple really tear a country apart? Let's dive in and find out.
Okay, so our traveler, Gulliver, he arrives and is immediately hit with this really perplexing scene. It's like he's found two different countries that are somehow living inside a single border, and they are just constantly at each other's throats, locked in this state of endless conflict.
And the dividing line was incredibly simple: the color of your hat. One side wore red, the other wore blue. But you gotta understand, this was so much more than a fashion choice. These hats were everything. They were your political faith, all wrapped up in a piece of felt. They dictated who your friends were, what news you were allowed to believe, and even how you were supposed to feel about the person living right next door.
And that is not an exaggeration. The account tells us this one simple distinction was all it took to create a state of perpetual hostility. This hatred was literally woven into the fabric of their society, all of it based on a piece of colored cloth.
So naturally, you have to ask, why? What on earth could be the reason? What huge fundamental principle could possibly fuel so much anger for so long? There had to be something big at stake, or so you would think. Well, this is where the story gets really wild. Because when you actually look at what both sides said they believed in, it was the exact same stuff. The red hats and the blue hats both praised liberty. Both condemned corruption. Both were terrified that their nation was on the brink of collapse. And, you guessed it, both were absolutely certain it was the other side's fault.
You can see why our traveler was so stumped. If they agree on all the big things, what in the world are they fighting about? He tried to pin them down, to ask them about specific policies their rivals supported, and the response he got was, well, it was very revealing.
Turns out, they didn't want to talk about policy at all. Instead, they would just go on and on about the terrible moral character of their enemies. The conflict wasn't about the nuts and bolts of running a country. It was about something way more serious to them. It was about identity. It was about defining yourself by what you stood against.
Now, a fire this big doesn't just keep burning on its own. It needs fuel. And Gulliver discovered there was a whole system in place, a kind of machinery that was perfectly designed to keep the fires of division burning bright.
Each side basically lived in its own media bubble. They had their own news oracles, as the story calls them. Red hats listened to their sources, blue hats listened to theirs. And these oracles weren't just reporting the facts, oh no. Their main job was to constantly remind their audience that the other side wasn't just wrong, they were malicious, they were foolish, and they were actively trying to destroy civilization.
One gentleman in the Republic laid out the logic with some pretty stunning cynicism. He said, look, it's absolutely necessary that our followers believe the other side is planning a catastrophe. Why? Because otherwise they might get bored. Think about that. The fear, the outrage, it wasn't a byproduct. It was the entire point. It's how you keep people hooked.
Their so-called public debates, forget about actual discussion. It was pure theater. The goal for any speaker wasn't to persuade the other side. Not at all. The goal was to get a round of applause from your own team and to provoke outrage from your opponents. Actually convincing someone from the other side would have been seen as a kind of betrayal.
And in all of this, who do you think was benefiting? The people making the hats, of course. The merchants were getting rich selling these symbols of division to both the reds and the blues, often making both colors in the very same factory. It was a flawless business model built entirely on conflict.
But here's what's so fascinating. What happens when you take that central symbol, the hat, out of the equation? Because underneath all of the political drama, real life was still going on.
Gulliver noticed that in their everyday lives, the red hats and the blue hats were pretty much indistinguishable. They shopped in the same stores, they watched the same shows, they often worked for the same companies, and they all complained about the same money problems. They had so much in common.
So, why all the hatred? A local scholar he met just nailed it. He said, if our enemies did not exist, we should have to invent them. It's just easier, right? It's easier to blame a defined other for your problems than it is to face up to how complicated things really are. The enemy serves a purpose.
And this all leads to the most remarkable thing our observer witnessed. He went to a party one night where, as was the custom, everyone took their hats off when they came inside. And suddenly, no one could tell who was a red and who was a blue.
And what happened was amazing. People just talked to each other about their kids, their jobs, their hopes and dreams. For a brief moment, they were simply people connecting on a human level, finding common ground without even trying.
But that moment was incredibly fragile, because as soon as somebody mentioned politics, the whole atmosphere just shifted. People started nervously scrambling for their hats, putting their team jerseys back on, and just like that, the friendly chat died and the bitter arguments started right back up again.
That single moment at the party, it reveals everything, doesn't it? It forces us to ask a really important question about the role of the hats. What if they weren't just a symptom of the problem?
Were the hats just a label? A simple way of showing which team you were on in a fight that was already happening? That's the easy explanation. But what happened at that party suggests there's something much deeper going on.
What if the hats weren't just representing the division? What if they were actually creating it? Maybe the physical act of putting on the hat is what turned a neighbor into an enemy. Maybe the symbol itself was the essential ingredient that made the whole conflict possible in the first place.
And that is the final and frankly the most chilling observation from the Republic of Hats. The people there admitted it themselves. They said they needed the hats. Not so they could know who to agree with or who to debate with, no. They needed them so it would be impossible to forget whom they were supposed to hate.